Well, hello, and welcome to a brief introduction on Augustine on the notion of liberty, what counts as true freedom. While discussing this, I'd also like to introduce students to a professional encyclopedia and the kinds of things that you'll find in an entry at the professional level. I'm working from this encyclopedia, Augustine Through the Ages. It's edited by Father Fitzgerald, and you can see the associate editors there, all high-quality thinkers and scholars of St. Augustine. The book itself comes in a large hardback edition. It's well worth having on your shelf if you're interested in doing further work on Augustine. But for the sake of working with undergraduate students or others who don't have the money to buy all of the encyclopedias that normally fit in a library, I've got a little workbook that has just essentially photocopies of those original texts. So here we are for the entry on liberty. And you'll see, like most encyclopedias, it's got a way of indicating the main entry, right, in a certain size font and bolded. And then it gives us this word libertas. Libertas is, of course, a Latin term, and it's translated liberty into English. But one of the things that we should clue into right away in a professional encyclopedia or anything else we're reading is that when the original language is given, that lets us know that the scholar who wrote this piece is referencing the original text. And that's really important because if we want to learn what Augustine thought, at some level, we really do need to read what Augustine wrote. And Augustine wrote in Latin. He wrote in North Africa in the 5th century. So we need someone who's kind of equipped to think through that, who has, the training in Latin and who's read a bunch of stuff from Augustine. In this case, we flip to the end of the passage, or the entry, and we see at the very end of that it's Marianne Juth who's written this article. She's a high-quality scholar who has access to Augustine in Latin and can produce her own kind of scholarship. All right, so this is a good sign. This clues us into the fact that we're dealing with a professional quality encyclopedia, someone who has had a good look at Augustine in the original language. And then we notice that she has broken the topic of liberty into a number of different subpoints: political liberty, religious liberty. A little more orientation to what's going on in a professional encyclopedia. We notice that there are all of these other subheadings. Take a look at one that's at the end, True Liberty, to show you a few things. Where the term is important in the Latin, we'll get some reference to that, vera libertas here. And then notice that the entry is full of references to Augustine's own works, right? So Marianne Juth, Dr. Juth, wants to tell us about, this idea, true liberty. Augustine contrasts false liberty with true liberty of choice that enables the will to function properly when uprightness is present. All right, she's right about that, right? And she knows she's right about that. She's going to give the reader a helpful introduction. If you want to read more about this idea of true liberty, then you need to read Contra Academicos 1:1, on free will, Liberum Arbitrium 1:1532, and the City of God, Civitate Dei 2:29. In other words, she's helping you learn Augustine better by directing you to primary texts where you can read more in depth about this concept, this phrase, vera libertas, and what Augustine means by it. All right, and then she gives us a summary, right? True liberty is a supernatural gift of God bestowed on the wills of the elect and virtue of Christ's redemptive love. We would expect to find that kind of theology in these passages. And if we were doing research on our own and trying to come to terms with this or thinking about what true liberty meant, this would tell us, regardless of whatever other text we've been reading from Augustine where we have a question about liberty, maybe we're reading Grace and Free Will, or we're reading Predestination of the Saints or something like that, then she's told us we should go back and have a look at these other texts that Augustine wrote. That's important. All right, the bibliography. A bibliography in a professional dictionary acts differently from a bibliography for a standard undergraduate paper. In a standard undergraduate paper, you're really trying to communicate mostly two things. The first is, look, I did some research, right? Dear professor, look at all these other things I read. I did the work for this paper. That's one thing a bibliography communicates at the lower level. Another thing a bibliography communicates is I'm aware of whose ideas these are. In other words, I do not want to plagiarize. I have engaged other scholars, and that's important at every level of scholarship to communicate, but especially at that undergraduate level, you have to be responsible about your sources and you have to report whence they came. So that bibliography does kind of two things for you there. In a professional encyclopedia, it's not doing those kinds of things primarily. There's sort of no one who thinks that a scholar asked to write this kind of an entry is straight up plagiarizing. And you'll notice the citations are all to the original text in Augustine, right? Because she's trying to teach us what Augustine means by libertas, and she's trying to be very faithful and genuine in presenting Augustine's own theology. So the bibliography here is like for further reading. In other words, these are important papers where you could go to find arguments about one side or another. Maybe there's an argument within the scholarship that Augustine really shifted his understanding of libertas at one point in his career, and someone thinks that it's at a different point in his career. Or maybe, there's arguments about which scripture voices are most important, or, whom Augustine is engaging or critiquing. All of those professional, in-depth conversations are going to be referenced in the bibliography, which effectively acts as a, so now what? Right? I finished reading this. I think this is a fascinating concept. I want to learn more about it. And we're already given an indication of what other things we should read. Now, a further indication that this is a high-quality professional encyclopedia can be noted in that the bibliography ranges across multiple languages. Not to be snotty about it, but it's like we know that she's read, these important articles in French. And, she's had access to it in Latin and some in English and some in Italian, right? That whatever important things have been said have been read, and that's all in the background of this. That's, again, one indication that we're dealing with a high-quality kind of professional encyclopedia. All right, so we've got the main entry. We've got reference to the original language. In this case, for Augustine, it's Latin. We've got copious references to Augustine's own works. We've got a high-caliber bibliography at the end. There's something else going on at the end of the entry here, and that is reference to other places in this same encyclopedia or dictionary where you could find related information. It's like you've read the 5 pages on liberty. Now you should go read the entry on anthropology. You should read the entry on the text libero arbitrio, and you should read the entries on grace and will. And so this gives you a lot of powerful information all stacked up together. And if you were looking to research, this would be a great way to start your research. Again, the bibliography continues on to the next page, and then we get the name of the author who wrote this little entry. All right, let's return to some of the ideas here that we're having. One, we've got this contrast between a Pelagian understanding of liberty and an Augustinian understanding of liberty. So the Pelagians believed that because liberty is a natural good, it can never be lost. But Augustine rejects this particular notion of liberty. Well, we're familiar already from having read Augustine with some of the distinctions between Pelagians and Augustine. The most common is that Augustine thinks grace is necessary and always first. And Pelagians are not convinced that grace is necessary and not convinced that grace is first. Now, Augustine thinks that human will is insufficient to achieve salvation, and characteristically, Augustine will argue that Pelagians think human free will is sufficient. There's a little middle ground there where sometimes we get confused, but the mature Augustine wants to argue that human will is necessary for salvation, that there's a role for human free will. And Pelagians agree. Pelagians think there's a role for human free will, but they tend to think it's sort of an exclusive dichotomy. Either I am responsible for getting me to heaven, or God is responsible for getting me to heaven, but not both. Right, now we go a step back and we ask, what's your underlying conception of liberty? And here it gets dense, but it gets fascinating. Augustine is arguing that we actually do not have liberty. We may have free will, but our free will is not free. And the Pelagian position is much more to say we do have liberty. Our free will is free. So it's like they're very different starting points for Augustinians and Pelagians. And a key way to articulate these categories, is to refer to to Augustine's sensibility in Latin about non posse peccare and posse non peccare and non posse non peccare. So let's chart those out, and I'll just give you a presentation of part of what's going on in this entry, but part of what's going on broadly in Augustine. We're talking about liberty. And liberty, for Augustine, is really the condition of freedom, that enables one to choose the good. Or it enables us to love well. Now, let's unpack that, because there are different notions of liberty, and Augustine's is unique to people who have grown up in a kind of modern context and tend to think of a different sense of freedom. So Augustine's got this scale, or this schedule, this timeline. If we think of Adam and Eve in the garden, Adam and Eve were able not to sin, and the Latin for that is posse non peccare. Able not to sin. After original sin, right? After the fall, Adam and Eve and the rest of humanity find ourselves out of the garden. This is the pre-lapsarian and the post-lapsarian condition. And in this condition, we are not able not to sin. Once we die and enter the resurrection, we'll be in heaven. We'll be redeemed. And there we will be not able to sin. Right, now we look at these terms and we tend to think, freedom would be when we're able to do something. But when we're not able, we're not free, right? That would seem to be just the plain and simple sense of the terms. But Augustine's actually arguing that non posse peccare, not able to sin, is true freedom. This describes libertas. Now, it's an Augustinian position that we will only achieve that in heaven, but why would this constitute true freedom? It seems like it's limiting, right? You're not able to sin. Well, for Augustine, the whole idea of liberty is that it's aimed at the good. The opposite of liberty is going to be a bad habit, a vice. And, another way of thinking of bad habits or vices is to think of addiction. All right, so to get into Augustine's mindset on liberty, we have to ask ourselves a question like, who is truly free? So think of the addict, and these are difficult things to think of. If I'm, dead level honest, I'm thinking of specific people, even in my family, dearly beloved people who are addicted to foreign substances, addicted to drugs and hardcore drugs, things that are definitely not good. But they're stuck in this cycle of addiction, right? They're unable to get out of it. And in that sense, in Augustine's terminology, they're not able not to sin. They're bound to sin. This addiction traps them. And we know the cycle of addiction, right? In the cycle of addiction, you lose sight of what's right, and you lose sight of wanting what's right, and you become unable to do what's right, even at many times unable to want or to think about what's right. But we know also when you're coming out of an addiction, you have this, we speak of it as a rock bottom experience, right? You bottom out. And part of that bottom is realizing that you on your own are unable to free yourself. You need help. You need professional counseling. You need sometimes the intervention of other drugs to help with withdrawal symptoms and chemical dependencies. You need good friends on whom you can depend. You need family. You need love. You need these relationships. You need all of these other outside influences to get over your addiction. But again, Augustine's observation is that when you are addicted, you are not free. Now, continue the line of thought. I know many wonderful men and women who have been sober for a long time. The healthy ones speak of themselves always as recovering. We're always recovering from addiction in this life. And that's also Augustine's point, right? We're addicted, we're broken, we're bent within. We're not aimed at the good. And in that sense, we're just not free. There's always going to be this temptation to fall back into our bad habits. There's always going to be the inclination to head back towards whatever that addiction is, whether it's, some foreign substance, whether it's some image, whether it's avoiding something or picking up something. We're always going to have that on us. And that means we're not free. Let's think about this in a different way. Let's pick something which, we would sort of all agree is not the right thing. Let's say something like, someone who wants to be a genocidal mass murderer. Someone who walks out of his house and looks out and just says, I would like to do horrible things to everyone around me. Well, we're very much of the mindset that person is not actually free. That person is not free to love his neighbor, right? I mean, that person has this huge, wayward, bad desire. There's something not right. There's something messed up. Let's say that person's really not free to do the good thing. Let's envision someone else for whom it makes sense to entertain mass genocide. It makes sense to be hateful to other people. And when that person walks out of his house, he thinks, I might want to kill everyone I see, but maybe I won't. Right? The first guy sees him and does it, and there you have it. The second guy sees his neighbors and thinks, I would like to eradicate everyone around me, is tempted by that and struggles with it. Right? Well, the guy who's tempted by it and struggles with it is a little more free than the guy who's actually doing it and cannot avoid it. But who would be the most free? Well, the most free would be the person who walks outside and sees his neighbor and doesn't even think, I wish that I could participate in some kind of mass genocide. The person who's most free would actually walk outside and see his neighbor and say, I love my neighbor. I want the good for my neighbor. And in that sense, the most free person is not able even to entertain the idea of doing something horrible, of doing something sinful. Right, so that's the sense in which Augustine says the truly free person is not able to sin. So true liberty is when sin no longer makes sense at all. Now, we can get better at this, and perhaps what happens in our lives is, some addictions are more tempting to me than other addictions are. And maybe those are different for me, right? Maybe there's kind of characteristic temptations for me that are different from characteristic temptations for you. For Augustine, that makes sense. We're all addicted to something, but we're not all addicted to everything, right? Again, we're not able not to sin. Something is going to tempt us, and we're going to give in. That's the current human condition. But where we're going, what Christianity offers, what grace does, is it moves us towards this not able to sin. The world makes much more sense. Now think about what that means for life in heaven. You've died, you've gone to heaven. Perhaps we're after the second coming and we all have our resurrected bodies in heaven. This is Augustine's understanding. No one is going to be in heaven thinking, yeah, but I sort of wish I could sin. I really miss those days when I wanted to go to hell. Right? That's just not what true freedom would be for Augustine. Right, now we think of freedom, we often think of freedom as actually indifference. And we're tempted to think then that freedom is like take it or leave it. I could sin or I could not sin. Right? I could go one way or the other. That would be perfect freedom. But Augustine says indifference is actually not freedom. You cannot be indifferent to evil. You cannot be indifferent to good. True freedom is what allows us to choose that good. That's what allows us to love well. Now, one of the sort of archetypes that seems to lie behind Pelagian and Augustinian conversations is that perhaps Augustine's always envisioning liberty in this way. And perhaps Pelagians are not always envisioning liberty this way. Perhaps at some point we're talking about, who's free. And it's like, well, leave me alone. Leave me to my sin. That's what would be truly free. And Augustine is always going to argue, but that's not true freedom. And God will never leave you alone. God is always working to restore your true freedom. And so grace will bring that liberty. And liberty will be that condition in which you're able to exercise your free will truly for the good.